Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cheng-Chien. I'm one of the committee member for the GDS group on data science of APS, and welcome to our virtual conference of this image show course. And as you know, APS virtual meeting got cancelled, and our GDS leadership team has put a lot of efforts try to make this virtual session possible. So here with me, we also have two other GDS members, William Radcliffe and Jay Ren, that will help me to moderate today's session. So we have two speakers today, Maxim Ziatdinov and Rama Vasudevan. So I will be introducing them shortly, and before that, I want to do a quick poll, and please help me complete this poll, okay? And also later you can in the question tab, and at the end of the talk, I will help to moderate them, and we have a short Q&A session. Okay, so while you are completing the poll, I want to introduce our first speaker, Maxim Ziatdinov. So Maxim is a research scientist in the computational science and engineering division at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So he works at the intersection between physical science and data analytics, especially interested in the synergy of theory, experiment, and data analytics in the fields of material science and nanoscience. Okay? So his work has involved the development of physical-based data analytics for automatic reading and recognizing complex molecule, atomic, and electron patterns from electron microscopy experiments. So Maxim received his PhD from material science engineering from Tokyo Institute of Technology in 2014, and followed by a postdoctoral appointment at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Okay, so with this, I will now close the poll. And Maxim, when you are ready, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for introduction. I hope everyone can hear me well and everyone can see my screen. So I'd like to give a brief tutorial on application of deep learning methods to imaging, and I'll start with a sort of conventional PowerPoint slide. It's about maybe 15 slides. And then we'll proceed to hands-on experience with Jupyter or Google Colab Notebook. So this is just a very brief outline. So I'd like to start with describing my own motivation for applying machine and deep learning methods to scientific imaging. Then I'll give a high-level intro into deep learning, just where it's used, where it has been successful, and so on. Then we'll go a little bit more deeper into details of some basic principles of deep learning training and validation. And then I'll show you some examples of how deep learning can be applied to scientific imaging and used to extract useful physical and chemical information. And then, as I mentioned, we will proceed to Colab Notebook. All right, so my own motivation for applying machine and deep learning to imaging is the following. So I work a lot with atom resolved data, and in fact, I got my PhD in working on scanning tunnel microscopy of graphene. And so what we usually deal with is we have a huge amount of atomically resolved images where we usually observe some interesting structural, chemical, and electronic phenomena. So we usually observe a lot of dynamic changes, like you can see in this image on the left, in this movie on the left. So you can see this is atomically resolved scanning transmission electron microscopy movie from graphene with silicon dopants. And things are changing very rapidly here because of the electron beam irradiation. And so you can see formation of different types of topological defects. You can see the dopant move. They interact with those topological defects, and then there are some larger defects like holes and this edge growth and so on. And what we really want to extract from this type of data is atomic scale physics and chemistry, like what are the main classes of defects in this data, how many of each class we have, how do they evolve in time, do they interact with each other, what are their, can we calculate things like their diffusion coefficient or transition probabilities if they switch between different states. So this is the type of information we want to extract from our experimental data. And in order to get there, it turns out that when we deal with this noisy data, conventional methods are not very appropriate methods to use. And so it turned out that we need to use not just one machine learning method, but a combination of different deepened machine learning tools. And we usually start with deep learning, which we use to convert noisy experimental data into atomic and defect positions and trajectories. And then we create libraries of structural descriptors using clustering and mixing techniques. And then if it's a movie, we analyze dynamics and transition probabilities using things like Markov modeling on the constructed descriptors. So that's our approach. But it obviously can be extended to many other imaging techniques, not necessarily atomic ones. But today we will talk mostly about how we use deep learning to convert noisy experimental data into atomic classes, positions, and trajectories using deep convolutional neural network. All right. So what is deep neural network? Well, basically you have an input, and then you have an output, and you have a neural network in between them, and you train your neural network to match input to output. Right? And the way you train it is that you're adjusting weight of individual layers. So the difference between shallow neural network and deep neural network is just that in the deep neural network, you have larger number of layers. That's pretty much it. Now, once we train the neural network, say to recognize cats versus dogs, then you apply your trained neural network to new and previously unseen data. And so the difference between shallow neural network and properly trained deep neural network usually is that deeper neural network is able to give you more accurate predictions. And that's why everyone loves them. So that's pretty much it. There is no big fundamental difference between the shallow and deep neural network. So deep learning has been quite successful in multiple areas, such as human-level image classifications, near human level speech recognition, sort of near human level autonomous driving, also ability to answer natural questions, improved search results on the web. Deep learning is also used in digital assistants like Alexa and Google Now, and so on. So the key difference between conventional machine learning tools and deep learning is that deep learning completely automates the feature engineering step in machine learning. So you don't engineer features like you would do for regular machine learning techniques. Your network actually learns those features from the data by itself. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into how deep learning training works. Okay, we start with our input data. It can be one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, four-dimensional, and so on. And so for this data, we should have some labels, aka ground truth. And so then we have our network, which consists of multiple layers, and each layer is parameterized by its weights. And so we pass our input through these layers, and then we get a prediction of this neural network. And then we compare this prediction to ground truth or labels that we must have in order to train a neural network. So let's say it tells us it's a cat, but maybe in reality it's a dog. And so we have some predefined loss function that we use to calculate a loss score. And we use this information about loss score as a feedback to optimize our weights, and then do it all over again. And so in the beginning, our loss score will be very high, which means the accuracy is very low. But if we do a proper optimization, then our loss score will gradually decrease, and our accuracy will gradually improve. And so there are three key principles here, right? So the network is parameterized by its weights. we use loss function to measure the quality of the network output, and then the loss score is used as a feedback to adjust the weights. So let's study in a bit more details each of these each component shown here. So input, okay. So our input data, as I mentioned, can be just a vector data, which will be represented as a 2D tensor. So it's number of samples times feature column. It can be time series data, which will be represented as a 3D tensor, which will be samples times time steps times features. It can be image data. Now, as you can see, the image data, the image will be two-dimensional, but the way it is represented in for neural network training in the most in every framework that I know, it will be represented as 4-dimensional tensor. So it's number of samples, which can be 1, it's fine, times width of each image times height of each image times number of channels. Now, if you use, so if you have a single grayscale image, it will be represented as 1 times width times height times 1. But you need to usually you need to explicitly specify number of samples and number of channels. And then, of course, we have video data where we just add extra dimension, which is frame. Okay. Now, usually we train our networks on pretty large number of images, and there is no way you can feed all of them at once. There will be just not enough memory, GPU memory to do that. And there are also some other reasons why you don't want to do this. And so what we usually do is that we break our data into smaller batches and feed each batch into a network. And typical size of each batch is between several dozens and several hundreds of samples per batch. So, okay, when you work with scientific data, and in most cases we work with experimental data, so the main question is, where do we get training data? And so sometimes we can have labeled experimental data. And in that case, so usually the ground truth is determined by a domain expert. And then we have this labeled set of experimental images which are labeled, and we split them into training set and test set. And then once so we use them to train our neural network and to monitor the test loss. And then once the network is trained, we use data from a different experimental batch as a validation set to make sure it can actually generate. But in the reality, we rarely have enough labeled experimental data. So in the case of atom-resolved imaging that I work a lot on, we usually use data simulated using a known physical model, right? So let's say if we look at some atomic structures, we can get training set from, we can calculate structures from first principle calculations or molecular dynamics calculations, DFT calculations, and so on. And then if we know the physical mechanisms of our imaging process, whether it's electron microscopy or some internal microscopy, we can actually simulate the image using the information, the structure that we have, right? And then, so in that case, our ground truth is limited. So we know the limitations of our ground truth. It's based on the limitation of physical model that we use. And then we do this standard train test speed. And then the interesting thing is what we do is this, what I call simulation to real world transfer, because we train our model on the simulated data, but then we actually apply it to real experimental data. And so this can be very tricky sometimes, because in some cases we can have a perfect accuracy, nearly perfect accuracy achieved on the simulated data, but then we apply it to experimental data, and then it turns out that it doesn't work. And it turns out this is because we didn't take into account certain forms of noise or certain forms of distortions that are common in the experiment. So it takes usually a lot of time to figure out how to prepare a proper training set. Okay, so in principle, well, I said that we usually label all of the data. There are some instances where we can actually use unlabeled data in things like autoencoders, but we are not going to talk about them today. And so sometimes we can get away with labeling only part of our data, but today we will be talking about more conventional cases where we have a fully labeled data set. And so there are two main classification schemes when it comes to images. One is an image level classification, where basically this image is a cat, this image is a dog, or in this case, this image is defect type A, or in that image is the defect type B. Or it can be pixel level, where we actually classify every pixel in our image. So this pixel belongs to an atom, and this pixel belongs to a background, and this pixel belongs to something else, and so on. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about, so this was input. So let's talk about neural network layers. So each layer of neural network transforms input data as following. It takes a dot product of weights and input, and it adds a bias term to it, and then it passes it through the nonlinear activation function, right? And so weights and biases are attributes of the layer, and they contain information learned by the network from exposure to training data. And so in the early days, people used the so-called fully connected layers. I'm pretty sure you saw this type of images a lot. Now, the problem with fully connected layers is that they are not really suitable for image analysis. Say if you have an image with height and width of certain pixels, then it would require 500,000 of parameters and 900 inputs. So it's just crazy in terms of memory and computational cost. And it don't really capture spatial patterns well. And so instead, these days, all images are analyzed with the so-called convolutional layers that uses proximity principle to restrict number of connections, and they can efficiently learn spatial hierarchies of patterns from data. So all deep neural networks for image analysis are convolutional neural networks. Okay, so let's talk briefly about loss function. So, okay, we pass our data through a neural network, we got a prediction, we compare that prediction to a ground truth, and now we want to calculate how accurate is our prediction. And for that, we use loss function. So loss function is the quantity that will be minimized during training. So it's some sort of measure of success. And for different problems, we choose different loss functions. So if it's a two-class classification problem, like is it a cat, or is it a dog, or is it an atom, or is it just a background? So we use a binary representative for that. For a multi-class classification problem, where let's say we have multiple chemical species in our image and we want to categorize them, we use categorical representative. So if it's a regression problem, then obviously we use mean squared law, and so on. Now, you can actually define your loss function, your custom loss function, which can be based on the physics of the problem that you are interested in. Okay, and then we calculated loss score using this predefined loss function, and we use this loss score to optimize our weight. So it's typically done with a stochastic gradient descent, and most of the optimizers is some kind of advanced variation of stochastic gradient descent. So again, we draw a batch of training samples and targets or labels. We run the network to obtain prediction. We compute difference between the prediction and the true ground truth or label. And then we compute the gradient of the loss with regard to the network parameter. And what we do next is that we move the parameters a little bit in the opposite direction from the gradient to reduce the loss in the batch. And so the backpropagation algorithm, which I'm sure you all heard about, is the result of applying the chain rule to the computation of the gradient values of a neural network. And so it works backwards from the, well, if this is your input and this is your output, then it works backwards from the top layer to the bottom layer, applying the chain rule to compute the contribution that each parameter had in the loss rate. Right, so this is a very high-level description, but there are plenty of textbook and material on it. All right, so, and that's pretty much it. And so you use it to optimize weights, and then you do it over and over and over again until your loss score is really lower and your accuracy is really high. That's pretty much it. Okay, so let me show you some real some applications of deep learning to real data. So on this slide, you can see an example of applying a UNet-like fully convolutional neural network to image denoising and entry finding. So on the left side, you can see an experimental data. On the right side, you see the neural network output. So basically, the neural network here accomplishes two goals. It removes all the noise from the data. So the image and the movie on the left is very noisy. The one on the right contains only atoms and no noise. And it also separates different atoms or defect types into different classes. So in this case, actually, what we see here is that red and green blobs correspond to different classes. I just used the fact that we have only two classes plus background, so I made a RGB, classical RGB image from it. But actually, these are different classes. All right, so some other examples. What is cool is that, if you have some areas in your image that as a domain expert that are useless, sort of junk, you can actually teach your neural network to avoid those areas. So as you can see in the image on the left, so the top row here is the image at the top is actual experimental image, and then the network output is at the bottom. And basically, it cleaned all the images. Here we have only one atom type, but then it also carefully avoided the amorphous regions, which we were not interested in. I can also distinguish between point-like defects and larger defects. So in this case, the same type of chemical species are forming amorphous region, and they are also in the bulb as a point defect. And so we were interested in point defects, but we were not interested in amorphous regions, and so we were able to exclude amorphous regions and just find all the point defects. And also, it is robust to changes in image dimensions with a few exceptions, but in general, you can have variable input size. So you can actually, you don't need to restrict yourself to the image of particular resolution. So you can feed images of, let's say, 256 by 256 or 512 by 512 and so on into the same network, which is quite nice for experimental data analysis, because you will experiment the image of all sorts of sizes and resolution. Okay, so what do we do with the neural network output? Well, we do physics extraction. So for example, in this example, we had a heroic material which had two sublattices, so we used neural network to clean it and to find atoms on each sublattice. And then we cropped images around one of the sublattices and made an image stack. And then we applied classical multivariate analysis to that image stack that allowed us to find the eigenvectors associated with heroic distortion in this material. And so we see the type of distortion happening in each unit cell and where these distortions are in a larger image. So that's one example. Another example is we don't need to focus only on atoms. We can find different types of defects. And so like in this case, we have a movie where defects are evolving in time, and we can use deep neural network to convert this movie into the type and positions of all the defects, and we use that information to reconstruct a spatio-temporal trajectory. And then you can see that along some of these trajectories, defect switches between different classes. And so it is possible to describe the switching process as a simple Markov process and to calculate the associated transition probability measure. You can also use deep learning for drift correction, and this work was done by Rama and Stephen Dace, and Rama is the next speaker, although I believe he won't talk about this part, but so I'll introduce it very briefly. So basically here is that your input, your training data is pairs of images, and your labels is a spatial mismatch between them, so delta X and delta Y. So you use these training images and labels to train a neural network, and then you apply it to previously unseen data. And so when you present a neural network with the two sequential images, it will return the drift between two images. So it will return delta X and delta Y. So that's how you can actually use neural network for drift correction. So on a somewhat more, so let's now discuss software and hardware aspects of this. So there are two main deep learning frameworks. One is TensorFlow, and another one is PyTorch. And the funny thing is, right now they're very similar. So it used to be that they were very different. TensorFlow 1.x was very different from PyTorch. PyTorch was very different from TensorFlow 1.x. But with the recent release of TensorFlow 2, they're almost identical with PyTorch. And so sometimes people ask me, like, what should I learn, PyTorch and TensorFlow? And actually, it's fine to learn first PyTorch, and then you will be able to use TensorFlow. Or you can learn first TensorFlow, then you will be able easily to use PyTorch. So this is just a simple example of how we define a simple regression model in TensorFlow and PyTorch. And if you go line by line, you can see that it's almost identical. So that's a great thing. Okay, so as far as hardware requirements are concerned, most of deep learning tasks require GPU accelerators. I would even say that all realistic deep learning images require GPUs or TPUs. I know some home institutions have, their own clusters, and some have supercomputers, and some don't. So for those that don't, or it's hard to access that hardware, there are some free options using cloud GPUs, like Google Colab, and I will talk about it just in a few minutes. It gives you up to 12 hours free GPU time, and then once it's over, it disconnects, then it reconnects again, and it will give you another 12 hours. There is also with Paperspace. To be honest, I've never used it, but I think it gives like up to 6 hours of free GPU time. There are also paid cloud GPU options, where like Google Colab has a pro version where they will give you, it's like $10 a month, and they'll give you 24 hours of free GPU usage. Google Cloud Platform, it's pay-as-you-go model, and I think they give you $300 credit for 1 year. AWS, haven't used it for like about 3 years, so I don't really know what are their current pricing. And there are many more cloud providers. So there are a lot of options to use GPU. Some of them are free, some of them are not. All right, so and right now I think we are ready to go to a tutorial. And I just wonder if someone has any questions at this point before we proceed to tutorial. No questions?
Okay, so we have 2 questions.
Okay.
One, actually both from Jessica Kong. Let's see if we can unmute her. Okay, Jessica, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it?
I can ask them. I was just wondering, so the first question I have is, what are some examples of loss functions that are based on physical problems, and what goes into defining like a loss function for your own specific need?
Yeah, so to be honest, you don't, I mean, I gave it as an example, but in most cases so far, I'm using just the existing loss functions, and they work pretty well for feature extraction. So it's more, I think, relevant for theory problems where you know your Hamiltonian and you can define loss function using that knowledge. So for the experimental data where we are interested mostly in feature extraction, the existing loss functions work, I must admit, pretty well. So I haven't seen a need at this point to actually use the custom loss function. But there are, we did some work on that some published at this point. So yeah, I can probably I can send you some examples
Okay.
later on. But for the examples that I'm going to show today, the custom functions like cross entropy loss, dice loss, they work pretty good.
Okay. Thanks. And the second question that I had is, how does the drift correction within neural networks compare with something like affine transformations? Like, does it take into account like rotations and kind of like these shear mappings, or is it only a drift?
So that's a perfect question. It really depends on how you train it. So in the example that I showed, it was only a drift, but it really depends on how you train it. I mean, it depends on what. So you have a pair of images, right? And then you have some transformation between these images. And so in this case, transformation was just a linear transformation. And then it has delta x and delta y from that. But you can actually define a transformation, and then your label will be the parameters of that transformation. And if you train the neural network on some more complex transformations, then it will be able to output the parameters of the transformation. So, but in the example that I showed, it did only drift correctly. But it really depends on how you train it. So, because the idea is that you have two images and then define some transformation, and then your label, like, so your input are those images and your output is the other parameters of that transformation. So in this case, the parameters were just delta x, delta y. But nothing prohibits you from defining more complex transformations and then using parameters of that transformation. So I'm not so as I said, I didn't really do that work, and I'm not sure if any comparison was actually done between the regular methods available in most of the software and the deep learning methods. So I'm not sure if I'm actually comparing.
Okay, so in this case, is it that you're kind of giving it? So for example, if I wanted to register two images and I had like an experimental image or two experimental images, and I wanted one to look like the other, I would say so if I had image A and image B and I wanted image A to look like image B, I would just set up some network and it would find the parameters of the transformation, or does it?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So
okay,
you need to generate training data first, and it's probably easier. Well, so you can have a batch of experimental images, and then so what you do is you simulate your transformation, your distortion, okay, and you train neural network on that simulated distortion, and then you apply it to real images. But yeah, so what you said is correct. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that it's important to have enough training data, and to generate the data. Again, the only way is to actually simulate, to create. So we have a pair of images. We take one image, and to create the second image, we probably just apply transformation to this first image, some transformation. Okay, that seems to be like the easiest way to do it. And in the case I showed, it was done on the entirely simulated data. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in the end, you have your pair of images, image A, image B, and then your output is the parameters of how much image B was shifted in this case compared to image A, and then you use those parameters to sort of shift it back.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Hi, Maxim. This is Cheng-Chien. I also have one question. By the way, for those who have questions, the participants, please post them in the question tab, so we can then later we can help read them out, or we can unmute you directly for you to interact with the speaker. So for Maxim, my question is, we know it's important to optimize the hyperparameters for better efficiency of the neural network. So do you use any software to help achieve this, or can you share some tricks?
Yeah, so yeah, we have so we work with we have collaborators at our National Lab who develop a software for optimizing hyperparameters in neural network called Mendel. And so what they basically have, they're using Summit supercomputer to run tens of thousands of neural networks simultaneously with different hyperparameters, and then they select the one that shows the best behavior on the given training set. So that's how we, and I think we have at least one published paper on that. So this can be helpful. But basically you have like tens of thousands of nodes on the supercomputer, and you run on each node you run a separate model. I mean the model is the same, but hyperparameters of this model. Okay, not that. That's not correct. The model is not the same because not to change hyperparameters to change model. So you run different models on each different node, but you can obviously restrict which things you want to change. And so then you out of those tens of thousands of different neural networks, you select the one that performs the best on your training data. So, or more specifically on your validation set. So that's one way that we did solve this type of problem. I must say that from my observations, the most important part is the training set, because like when you deal with noisy data, it's and a lot of distortions. It's all about how you can actually incorporate all the laws into your training set, and it's more important than hyperparameter search. I mean, there are certain type of networks, like for example, we stick with the UNet-like models, and we modify them, we customize them, but and I'll talk about them more. But at some point, I realized that whatever small tweaks to hyperparameters we do, they're kind of within the error bar that we have because of all the noise that we have in our data. So they don't really improve things that big. So that's just my experience. So just to summarize my answer is that the way we do the hyperparameter adjustments is that we just use supercomputer to train tens of thousands of neural networks with different combination of hyperparameters, with different number of convolutional layers, different types of filters, and so on. And then we select the one that performs the best on the training, on the validation set. But I must say, however, that in some cases, just preparing a better training data actually outperforms that network that was selected by a supercomputer. So it's all about having a proper training data, I believe.
Okay, thank you for the detailed response. So maybe a follow-up. So the Mendel software you just mentioned, is that a release as an open source software, or do you have access to that?
So I don't think it's an open source. I can put you in touch with people who own it. I don't believe it's an open source, and but I can put you in touch with people who developed it.
Okay, thank you.
Or I can just send you a paper link to you.
Okay, great. So it seems that we don't have any more questions. So do you want to proceed with the hands-on part?
Yep.
Okay, great.
All right, so I prepared several tutorials in Google Colab, and I was asked to start with a basic introduction into Google Colab. And I'm pretty sure that many of you are familiar with this tool, but for those who don't, who have not used Google Colab, I'll just give a very brief introduction. So first of all, so Google Colab is a free research tool. So the most important thing is that it's free. So it's a Google product, and it was created for machine learning education and research, and it's built on top of Jupyter Notebook. And so from our experience, it is also an ideal tool for scientific collaboration and sharing the results with non-experts, right? Because I mean, the proper way to have a collaboration, any kind of collaboration that involves machine learning or data analysis is having a GitHub or GitLab project. But obviously, not everyone actually is familiar with GitHub, and it's it was created by software developers and having by software developers, so not necessarily for the main science. And so it's also very common that there are very large fluctuations in the coding skills across a team in collaboration. And so GitHub is not always a suitable way to do the collaboration. Google Colab is still a great tool for this, right? And so if you want to use Google Colab, all you need to do is that you need to be logged in with your Google account, and then you just type like Google Colab and there is Google Colab, right? And it will land you on the starting page of Google Colab. It also has a short introduction, although I believe it's a little bit useless, but you can read it yourself. Okay, so I'll just give a very brief introduction to the basic operations in collaborative notebook. So, so the general rule of any Jupyter notebook is that you click inside the cell with the code, and then you press Shift Enter to execute it. If you re-execute it, you will lose any input, and you always execute cells from top to bottom. Now, some collab-specific rules is that notebooks are saved to your Google Drive, so you have to log in with the Google account in order to use Google Colab. You can actually use files from your drive, and you can save files to your drive from your notebook. This includes the team drive or shared drive. So again, it's very convenient for collaboration, having all the information, all the data stored on one of those team drives, and then using Google Colab to access them and to save outputs to that team drive. Now, tricky part is that so Google Colab gives you free virtual storage, but it lasts only 12 hours or until you reset your runtime. So once it happens, all the uploaded and stored files will be deleted. So if you want to store something, you actually need to mount a Google Drive and store it there, or download it all the time to your local machine. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah. So the way we use Google Colab is usually, so let's just so you can get the best way. Okay, I probably can skip this part about GitHub. So let's just go to how we upload and download files. So you see this left pane here. I can right, so you open it like this, and you have this files icon. And for some reason it says that I need to sign in. So okay, now I'm signed in. And so it has this files icon, and this is where you actually can mount your Google Drive. So you press on it, and it will insert this cell, which will mount your Google Drive, and will give you a warning because it's not made by Google. Okay, so you just copy paste this access code. In here, and if you have a lot of files in Google Drive, it will take maybe like 10 to 15 seconds to mount it. Okay, so it's mounted now, and then if you refresh, you now can see a Google Drive here, and if you can have your personal drive here, and also the shared drives, or call them team drives. So, like in this case, these are all the projects I'm working on, and I have a data notebook stored in this shared drive. So very convenient. If you want to download something, you can just okay, I'll show you later how to download things. You can upload stuff from your personal laptop from the local machine using that upload. So it's pretty convenient. Okay, so let's move further. Okay, so just go through this notebook. I tried to put some screenshots of how to use them. Now, the cool thing is that you can actually share your notebook just like you share Google Docs. So you share it with so it needs to be copied. So in this case, you need to copy it to your Google Drive first. And once it's on your Google Drive, you can share it the same way you share any other things that are on your Google Drive. Right. So now you can share it with people. You can give them different permissions, edit, comments, view, and so on. So it's very very convenient. The other cool thing that you can do is that you can actually comment each notebook cell or something like that, right? So it's very nice if you're working with students, or students have some questions that they just leave comments, and then I can answer. I can reply to those comments. Obviously, I can even reply to my own comment. Okay. So the cool thing about Google Colab also is that it has everything pre-installed. It has all the standard packages like NumPy, Matplotlib, all the classical and machine learning methods, machine learning frameworks, all the deep learning frameworks like the TensorFlow, PyTorch, and Maxim, and so on. Right? So you don't need to install anything. You just import things and then you start working. So you don't need to create environment, don't need to do anything of that sort. So if you share your notebook with someone who is not really familiar with how to, install software locally, create local environments and so on, they don't need to actually do this. They can run it code right away. Okay, so right now Google Colab doesn't have an option to open and work in a terminal or shell, but you can still invoke a terminal command by using either shell magic command or by prefixing the command with an exclamation mark, right? And so there is this cool thing which is a scratch code cell, so sometimes you don't really want to add another code cell into your notebook because it looks messy and sometimes people forget to delete them. But you can just do things in your you can do some operations in your in the scratch code cell, and then you can just close it and forget about it. So very convenient. Okay, and so here I just described some common command line tools which we don't really need to go through. It's just basically how to create new files, delete them, and so on. Not super important. Okay, and now one other thing is that, okay, so you always save and store data to your Google Drive, but once you share it with other person, obviously you don't want other person necessarily to have access to your folders in your Google Drive. And so what you usually do is that you just get a shareable link of folder of files that you want to work on. And so you usually put this in the beginning of the notebook, and you just download those files into the notebook, and then if it's zipped, then you unzip them, and then you start working on them. The only thing here is that once you get a shareable link, it will look like this, and then it will have this open question mark and then ID. So you need to replace open with UC, and then it will become a download link. So this is how you change shareable link to download link. And then it will download whatever files you want to be downloaded into your notebook. Okay, so installation. So as I said, Google Colab has a lot of popular machine and deep learning packages that are already there, and you don't need to install them. But if you want to use some specific package that is not yet in Google Colab, you can install them using a simple pip install command, right? So in this example, I use NumPy, which is a probabilistic machine learning library. And so first I try to import it, and then it will tell me that model is not found. And then I just put exclamation mark and pip install NumPy. And good. And so it will install it. And then you can import it and start using it. Now, in some cases, some packages, they don't have a pip package. They don't have, there is no way you can install them with pip, so you actually have to download them to clone Git repository, and then use the setup.py file to install them. So then you use this exclamation mark git clone, the repository name, and then you change directly into that repository, and then you run Python setup.py install. Now, the only tricky part here is that if you do that, you will actually have to restart your runtime, right? So if you just do that and then you try to install try to import your newly installed package, it will be impossible. You won't be able to do that. And so you actually will have to restart your runtime in order to be able to use it, and you restart your runtime using this runtime. Okay. So that's pretty much it. And there are some options to connect your Google Colab notebook to deep learning virtual machines for Google Cloud Platform, which is a paid option. So you can, I have a short video here. You can watch it. So that's pretty much it. That's how it's very easy. I think that one other thing that I need to mention is that I said that when you run deep learning, you need I think probably well, I mentioned it already in the presentation, didn't mention it here, that Google Colab also gives you a free GPU option. So if you go runtime and then change runtime type, you can see that you have the hardware accelerator option, and you can select GPU and TPU, right? And so now you select GPU, and it will actually connect us to a different virtual machine, and then we can see what kind of GPU we have. And for some reason it takes very long. I don't know why. It's probably because I started running this stuff before it actually connected. But anyways, I'll show it in a different notebook. We don't have really time to wait for it. So okay, so that was the introduction to Google Colab. And now let's actually do some deep learning. So I wanted to show first an example of how to use how to run a simple regression with a neural network in PyTorch, right? So neural networks are universal function approximators. And so just a simple illustration here, let me just reload this page. Right. So neural networks are universal function approximators, and here just as a simple example, we will generate data points using a simple sin x. Okay, there is, I don't even know what's going on with my internet, but it's something that has to do with my internet. So just give me a second. I'll close this whole. Maybe it's fine. I hope it's fine. I apologize for it. My internet. I have to work from home because we do social distancing, and my internet connection seems to be not right. But I hope it will work. So anyways, we are going to train a simple regressor, right? So we are going to use PyTorch deep learning library for that. So we do imports. Yes. Okay. So it also has some limits on the. We cannot have like 10 sessions running simultaneously. Let me close them. Okay, so sorry for those small technical glitches. So we import PyTorch deep learning library, and then we also import matplotlib for plotting. Now, one of the critical things when working with these frameworks is that, you know, for whatever reasons, people who develop them were not super concerned about reproducibility at first. Now things changing. So it was not uncommon for quite some time that, you know, you have the same neural network, you train it twice, and you actually end up in a slightly different state, right? So you get two slightly different neural networks. They're very similar, but they're not identical, which is, you know, when you use it for scientific data, it's kind of very disturbing that you actually cannot have a full reproducibility, right? So what you need to do is that you need to fix a few parameters to make sure that your results will be reproducible. And so one parameter is obviously seed for generating pseudo-random numbers. You do it using torch with a manual seed. So CUDA stands for GPU here. Okay? So there's a lot of randomness coming from GPU, right? So if you don't use GPU, you just fix manual seed and that's it. But if you use GPU, there is a lot of randomness that comes from GPU, and so you want to make sure that you will be doing only deterministics, running only deterministic operations in GPU, which, by the way, will make it a little bit slower. But that's the price you need to pay for reproducibility. And then you also need to specify that this benchmark set it to false. Just set it to false. There is no much we need to know about it, right? So as long as you set these parameters, and if you use also obviously, if you generate your data using NumPy, then you also need to set proper experiment for NumPy. But once you set this parameter, you should be good. You should have reproducible result. Okay. All right. So let's generate. So let's generate some training data. Let's plot it. So that's how our training data looks like. And now let's construct a simple neural network. And there are two ways to construct neural network. One is this using the PyTorch sequential container, and another one using the object-oriented way of constructing model. So this is a sequential container. You basically put a bunch of dense layers here, each activated by the rectified linear unit. Well, it's called leaky because it doesn't exactly zero all the negative values. There is some 0.01 soft for negative values. But so you put everything in a sequential container. So linear here, it means just that you have this fully connected layer. So I wanted to be clear because it's a little bit confusing. So when we say linear here, what we mean is, where is it? So we mean this standard fully connected layer. So this is what linear means in PyTorch. Okay, so we have we have 100 neurons in the first layer, 100 neurons in the second layer, and 100 neurons in the output layer, and that's it. Okay, and they're all activated by the nonlinear activation function. Let's define our model here. And in case we have GPU, and in this case I don't use GPU because it's a very simple task. But if we have GPU and so Torch CUDA is available, tells you whether we have GPU or not, then we need actually to transfer our model and our training data to GPU. So it's model.CUDA, x.CUDA, y.CUDA, and then they'll all fit in GPU. But actually, in this case, we don't use GPU. And so here we specify our optimizer, right? Atom optimizer is just the advanced version of the stochastic gradient descent. So you specify a learning rate here, LR is learning rate, and then you define your loss, and loss is commonly called criterion here, and it's just mean squared error. So that's it. So we specify this, and then we train our neural network. And so we will have 2,500 training iterations. And so for each, they are called epoch. So for each iteration of epoch, we start to make sure that we clear all the gradients for our optimizer. And then we propagate variable x through a network, and we get prediction. And then we compare our predicted value with the ground truth and calculating mean squared errors. And then we do backpropagation to compute gradients, and then we optimize weights. And then we save the loss so that we can just plot it later. So as you can see, it's just what I've been showing here, right? So input, prediction, compare it with labels, then calculate loss function, and then I use loss score to adjust the weights. So that's fine. So it's pretty fast because it's a very small data set and we don't need GPU for it. So you're just running on a regular CPU. So you can see that our loss is decreasing, which is good. Okay, so we are done. Let's plot the training loss. So our loss saturated actually somewhere around 1,500 after 1,500 iterations. So we could have actually stopped here, right? So if we have used GPU, we should actually transfer our data back to CPU and convert it to NumPy. And we have to convert it in NumPy in any case because it's now in a torch format, and it's not okay. You can leave it in torch format, but for doing regular plot, it's easier to transfer it to NumPy, to transform it back to NumPy array. Okay, and now we plot the results. Okay, so the model prediction is the orange curve, and our data set is the blue dot. So you can see that actually neural network did a pretty good job of fitting this data set. Okay, so now let's do the same thing, but in the object-oriented way. And in this case, we specify our networks in 2 steps. First, we specify model parameters using this init, and then we outline how they are applied to the inputs using forward. Okay, so here it's just the same neural network. We have 2 layers, well, 3 layers, but one is just an output layer, right? So it's a number of neurons, it's 100 here, we will specify it later. It's just the same as we used before, it's just slightly different way of defining it. Now, the reason why we want to use usually the object-oriented way of coding our neural network is that simple neural networks can be written using the sequential container. But more complex neural networks, when you have multiple branches and you want to feed information from one branch to the certain point of another branch, so you cannot write it just a sequential container. You actually need to do it in the object-oriented way, and that's why we're using it. But this is just the same neural network. Okay, so we define it same as before. So we define it here. We initialize it here. Right, we say that number of neurons is 100, and then if GPU is available, we transfer model and data to GPU. We define optimize and loss function, and then this is the same training loop that we had. And so again, we're going to train it for 2,500 iterations. Okay, and actually, if you look at the loss value, well, not 2,500, 2,400, but anyways, if you look at the loss value here, it's actually the same as loss value here. So we just defined a model differently, but it's the same model. And again, speaking of people with disability, you see, we trained our neural network twice by defining the model in a different way, and we ended up with exactly the same loss. So we have full reproducibility there. So we can plot training history. Again, it's exactly the same training history. We can transform our PyTorch standards to NumPy arrays and plot the results. It is exactly the same result that we have. Okay, and then we can get some new point and check how our model performs on this new point, because the whole point of any machine learning exercise is actually to have accurate predictions on previous points and data. So you can see it's pretty close to value in this case. So that's how you can actually that's how you can construct. Okay, so what we saw here is that there are 2 ways of constructing neural network. The one is using a sequential container, and another one is using the object-oriented way. And both of them give you the same result. But so for simpler models, you can use sequential container. For more complex models, we should use the object-oriented way of defining the neural network. And another important thing is that we need always to specify the seed for generating random numbers. And if we use GPU, then we also need to set these plots to true and false, effectively. Otherwise, we won't have reproducibility. Okay, so looks like we don't have much time left. And so let's go to actual images now. So let's see how we can actually use fully convolutional neural networks for image analysis. And so in this notebook, which is called UNet Atomic Images, it demonstrates how to use a simplified version of the UNet fully convolutional neural network for performing a multi-class semantic segmentation of atomic images. And so let me just show you what UNet is briefly. So you can follow this in the notebook. Thankfully, there is a Wikipedia article on that. So UNet is something like this. You have the contracting part, you have the bottleneck layer, and then the expanding part. And then the resolution of the input image is the same as the resolution of your output. And it provides you a classification of each pixel in your data. Okay, and so in this case, I'm just going to use a very small and simple training set prepared from just a single but very large experimental image of bismuth of BF4 sample. And because the image is very large, we have various distortions across the image. And so we labeled every atom using the information about the XY coordinates. And I have a link here which actually shows how the training set was generated. So you can follow this link. We don't have really time for this, but and alternatively, we can just use simulated data, as I talked about before. And so here the goal is to train a neural network that could generalize and perform fast identification of atomic positions of different kind of images with different noise levels from the similar system, but from a different experimental batch, right? This is simplified training set. You should use much more diverse training set. You should not use a single image for your training data, but in the interest of time, we will just use a very small tool. So again, we import models. It's PyTorch models, and then just NumPy and Matplotlib inside system model. Okay, so again, we have a helper function for reproducibility. So now let's download the training data. So again, if you follow while it's downloading, so if you follow this link here, it actually shows how the training data was generated from the experimental data. Right, so we had an experimental data and we use it to generate training data. So it's overlaid, so we have the atomic data, and then we labeled every pixel in the data. So we have two different sublattices, and we labeled them as different class. And then what we did, and this is just one small images from that labeled image from that larger image. And then what we did is that we applied different forms of noise and image distortion to each of that sub-image. So we had a 3K by 3K image. We cropped like a, well, in this case 500, but I think for that training set that I'm going to use, it was about 2,000 images of 256 by 256. And then we applied a unique combination of different types of noise and distortion to each image. And then we, so in the end, it looks like this. That's how a training set looks like. So it's still downloading it. Yeah, it's taking some time. I don't know. So I hope it will. Yeah, okay, it's almost done. Yeah, my internet is very slow. Sorry about that. Okay, so it downloaded training data, and so what we're going. Also, first we just plot it. So this is how our training data looks like, right? So and the goal is to get from images, to train a network to be able to get from images at the top to images at the bottom, right? So at the top you see noisy data with a lot of distortions, and at the bottom you can see, so different colors again correspond to different classes here. So we have class background, and then we have classes corresponding to two different atomic classes. And the goal is to train a network to get from the noisy data to the clean data, and while splitting different atomic species into different classes. Right, so here are some extra details which you should read, but we don't have time for that. So basically, okay, PyTorch already provides a lot of good building blocks for preparing for different types of neural networks. But sometimes you don't want to write the same 20 lines of code like 20 times. And so it's easier to specify to use that building block to specify new building blocks that we know we are going to use for many times. And so here I just specify a convolutional block, which includes, so it's a convolutional operation, and then we have followed by the leaky review, and then we can optionally put dropout and patch normalization. So these are two types of normalization, regularization. To prevent overfitting, right? So, and then we also define upsample block where we do upsampling using either bilinear or nearest neighbor interpolation, followed by one-by-one convolution, which can be used to reduce the number of feature chains. So this is just for convenience. Okay, now we are defining our small unit, so it's smaller than a classical unit. Basically, so again, just as we always do in PyTorch and in TensorFlow as well. First, we specify our network parameters, and then we outline our network parameters, and then we specify how they are applied to how we're going to apply them. Right. So in this case, we just have a contraction path, which is convolutional block, a multiple layer, another convolutional block, multiple layer, another convolutional block, multiple layer. So multiple layer downsample it by a factor of 2 into the bottleneck layer, and then we have the expanding path where we sample them, and then we feed the information from the contraction path into the expanding path by doing this concatenation. So we make sure that there is information flow between the contracting path and expanding path, and that information is not lost during the doing something. Okay, and then in the end, we have the final layer, which is used for pixel-wise convolution. So there is this, actually, probably I need to actually run them. Okay, so let me just run this. Okay. All right, and we can actually visualize them. There is this nice module called TorchViz. It's not installed by default, so we install it here, and you can visualize. It looks a little bit scary because I think it shows a lot of things which are not really necessary, but you can get the idea from here. Right, so this is our bottleneck here, and here we have the expanding part. And these are these so-called skip connections. So we can see that we feed information from our contraction path here, so from here all the way here, to make sure that information is not lost during the max pooling operation. Okay, and so here again we define our feed for reproducibility. We initialize our model. In this case, we actually move it to GPU because it's impossible to train it without GPU. We specify a loss function. It's cross entropy loss because we have multiple passes here. And then we specify optimizer. Then again, we use other optimizer. Learning rate is 1 to the power -3. We specify batch size. As I said, we cannot feed all the images at once. So we have like about 2,000 images, but we feed them batch by batch. The size of each batch is 32 images. Number of chaining cycles, just 500, and then those are very important. Okay, so and then it's quite similar to what we had before. There is some additional coding because we select a specific batch of images randomly at each iteration cycle, and then we transfer them to the GPU, and then it's just the same. So we clear gradients in optimizer, we do forward path, we calculate loss function, then we do backward path and optimize the weight. So it's just the same. And then here we also have evaluation step where we deactivate our autograd engine, and we just pass a batch of test images through a network and calculate loss function in the test. And then we just print this is everyone from it. So let's run it. So hopefully it will take, I think, yeah, it will take some time, which I'm not sure we have. So, but in the end, you will see something like this, which again we have a nice conversion of our training loss, and then yeah, maybe we will be able actually to see the result. So you can see again that our training loss is decreasing. So what we are doing, and there are many ways of. It's up to you how you actually feed your training data. And in this case, I have like I think around 60 batches of training images. Each batch can around 50 batches of training images. Each batch containing around 30 images. And so in each cycle, I randomly select a batch from that list of training data, and I feed it into network. So it's very stochastic training. But in some cases, so each epoch is equal to just one batch. But in some cases, in many cases, people just feed all the batches one by one into a network during one epoch, and then they calculate the average loss for all batches. And the loss that they display is that average loss. In that case, the average loss is very smooth. So in this case, it's very stochastic training, so you can see that the average loss, so that our loss will be, it's not an average loss, and that's why it will be more real. But the results are pretty much the same. So actually, we're almost done training. But yeah, actually, let's wait. detected cloud. So it's actually very fast, as you can see, although the network was simplified. Okay, and we are done. So let's plot the, so again, same training loss. And what we're going to do now is that we are going to see how it performed on the validation of test data. So let's run it. And so here is the test image. So it was not used for training, for weight optimization. And so you can see it's on the left, and then here in the middle, you can see model prediction. And this is the ground truth that network has not seen. So you can see that our prediction is quite good. We was able to remove all the noise and then find all the atoms. And you can see that the most important part is that it is actually able to find the small local distortions. That, you know, there are many other ways of actually cleaning images and finding atoms, but most of them are based on the FFT, and in that case, we won't be able to do the small local distortions. And now we can actually, so okay, one thing is that, okay, we have these beautiful blobs on the uniform background, but we actually need to convert it to atomic coordinates. And here is the function that the class that actually does it. And so we actually can use it to calculate all the coordinates, and now we plot the actual coordinates here. So here, so these are our coordinates. Okay, and let me show you that. So we can use this model that was trained on a single experimental image, and then we apply it to an experimental image from a different, slightly different sample. So the host material is the same, but experiment was different, and the dopants were different there. And so let's just apply a neural network to that image, and take some time to plot. Okay, and you can see that actually when we apply it to a different image, it was able to find atoms in that image, that different experimental image that other systems have never seen before. And we have analyzed this image before, so I know that this is quite an accurate result. So again, the important point is that it was able to find these small local distortions that wouldn't be possible to find with some of the methods that are based on the FFT and the typical space. So that's pretty much it. Sorry, I had to skip some parts because at some point I realized that my time is almost I'm out of time. But that's and so you can extend it. It should not necessarily be atoms. It can be different types of defects. It can be some macroscopic features even in the images. You can apply it. You can do it. You can train and apply and everything pretty much. So I think I'm done. There are a few other tutorials there. Feel free to check them. But I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you very much, Maxim, for your very nice presentation and detailed tutorial. So we don't have much time left. We have to continue with the second talk. Thank you very much. Thank you. So before I start to introduce the second speaker, we have two generic questions about the video recording. So after the talk, we will be processing these videos and post them on YouTube. So please follow us up on YouTube. You can search APS GDS. And also we will enable the closed captioning function so that you will be able to see subtitles in those YouTube videos as well, in case the audio recording is a problem. Okay.
Just wait. So if you have any questions, then feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to answer.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. So Rama, are you here? Let's see.
Yeah, I think Rama is here.
Okay. Rama, is you audio unmute already, or? Oh, I think we have to change presenter. Sorry.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so we'll continue with our second talk of today's virtual session. So it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Rama Vasudevan. So Dr. Vasudevan is now a staff scientist and the data analytics coordinator also from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So he completed his PhD in material science, especially a scanning probe microscopy for ferroelectric materials from University of New South Wales in 2013. So his current research is focusing on marrying machine learning methods with a principle of statistical physics to understand the microscopic mechanism that governing material phenomena. So his research interests also include ferroelectrics, scanning probe microscopy, and reinforcement learning for material synthesis applications. And today he will talk about learning physics from imaging data, mesoscopic and stochastic systems. Okay, so Rama, please go ahead when you are ready.
Thank you, Cheng. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present this webinar. You know, it would have been nice if we could do it at APS, but this is actually probably even better because we have, I see we have 60 attendees. So I hope this is useful for you all, and I hope you're safe wherever you are. So I'm going to talk to you about how we can learn physics from imaging data. So we had just a very nice webinar by Maxim where he showed how we can extract features using deep neural networks on images. I want to go one step beyond that and say, okay, so once we have these features, how can we learn the relevant physics that are actually embedded within these images? And so I'll kind of split it up half-half. So the first half will be a talk and some questions, hopefully, if you have any. And then the second half will be a Colab notebook where we'll go through an example of where we can actually do this. So before I start, I would like to, let me go to the next page. Yeah, I would like to acknowledge all of my collaborators on this work. Mani Valetti, who's a student at University of Tennessee, who did some of the work that I'm going to show. Maxim, of course, you heard the previous speaker. So he's been integrally involved in this work. Lucas Vilcek, who was a former scientist at Oak Ridge, but is now in St. Louis with Bayer, but he's a modeling person. And so he's worked a lot on statistical physics, and so I'd like to acknowledge his contribution here, as well as my colleagues at the Center for Nanophase Material Sciences, so including Sergey Kalinin and Stephen Jesse and many others who have been involved throughout this work. So just to remind you, I am from the Center for Nanophase Material Sciences, which is basically this building here. I think you can see my cursor. Maybe I will make a better pointer. So there we go. Okay, so what we see here is we see our building. It's right next to the spallation neutron source, which is a world-renowned neutron science facility. And so, you know, we're very lucky to be able to partner with a larger facility. And so we're one of 5 nanoscience research centers within the United States. And so we operate much like other user facilities within the Department of Energy complex. In other words, we have a proposal system, people write proposals, and then when those are accepted, they get time on our instruments and to our expertise. So the point of this webinar is really that to answer the question, you know, what do we do with all the imaging data that we actually have and that we actually collect? So, you know, it's been very clear from the 50s, really, if you go back to Feynman's APS talk, that people were wanting to start to image materials at the atomic level, you know, for basically as long as science has existed, right? So that's all very well and good. And you know, you can read about the history of how the electron microscope was invented and how the scanning tunneling microscope was invented. But one critical feature I think that has been somewhat missed is that what do we actually do when we start to see atoms, right? So we see atoms, for example, in this case on the left, we see a closure domain state in bismuth ferrite. okay, this is all well and good, this is nice, right? So we can see these structures that form, this is electrical polarization that forms this kind of closure domain structure. Does it actually tell us something beyond, just what our eyes can see, right? So can we then derive parameters for a lambda model that can explain this kind of structure by looking at this image, right? If I look at oxygen vacancies on the surface of on a rutile surface, right, with scanning tunneling microscopy, can I look at how they're distributed here and then extract an interaction energy between the existing oxygen vacancies? There is a lot of things that we could potentially extract from imaging data, but we're not actually currently doing it. And the way that we try to say this is that although images are present, the amount of transferable material science knowledge that we're actually extracting from these images is rather limited, right? So what we would like to do is we would like to say, let's get the imaging data that we have, and then let's analyze it and then try to extract the maximum amount of transferable material science knowledge that we can from each image that we have. So this is a little bit different from the way that most people approach material science, right? So if I'm studying a new material system, right, what would I do? Generally, what happens is that you go ahead, you synthesize this system, and then you go ahead and measure different properties, usually some kind of bulk measurement. Let's say it's a dielectric spectroscopy, right? So let's say it's optical spectroscopy or some other kind of bulk measurement. But you do so through thermodynamic space. So in other words, different temperatures and different compositions, and you try and plot the phase diagram, right? So you'll basically have to create a lot of different samples, measure them at different conditions. And then once you have this kind of data, you'll go back to theorists and say, okay, how can we tweak input parameters that kind of give us this kind of phase diagram, okay? So that's one way to approach the problem. And it has been the general way that this problem has been approached in material science for basically the last 100 years. But this is quite time consuming because we need to create all of these different samples. We need to measure them at all of these different conditions. You can ask a question, is this really necessary, right? So can we get away without having to do so many measurements? And how much of it is redundant, right? So another approach that we would like to propose is, how about we go from images to models, right? So when we image a system, for example, in this case, a manganite surface, lanthanum calcium manganite, can I take this image, can I derive as much physics as I can from it to create this kind of statistical or generative model, physics-based model, from which I can sample, right? And so I can create these different configurations from this generated model that comes from the image, and then that will be able to predict my phase diagram, and then I can go and tweak it based on new experimental data that I get. So, this is a pretty powerful concept, but in principle, it's perfectly doable, right? If we have enough images of our material system, we should be able to extract the relevant physics. And I'll explain why in the next few slides. So let's kind of dial this back a little bit, right? So most people here are familiar with, standard phase diagrams or binary phase diagrams. You probably studied them in second year of material science or a physics-based course. So let's say that we have a system, and we have system A, and I'm going to add or alloy it with system B. So maybe at some critical concentration, the system phase segregates, and so I have this phase diagram where for some concentration I have a solid solution, and from some other concentration I have this kind of phase separation, right? And so there's obviously some dependence with temperature. The question I have is, so here we have a solid solution in this phase, and here we have this alpha beta phase segregation. So let's say that I have a sample, right? So I make my sample here, so it has, at this temperature and at this particular composition, and this is where I'm going to image it. What does it actually mean, right? So when I say that this sample has this composition, well, it means that there is a distribution, right? So this distribution in equilibrium is a Boltzmann distribution, and so you don't have that composition exactly, right? So this is a nominal composition. Locally, you could have higher levels or lower levels of B within your system, and there's a distribution of that, and that distribution is given by this Boltzmann distribution for an equilibrium system. So when we actually image a system like this, what we are doing is actually imaging the microstates of the system. And if you've studied a statistical physics textbook, what you know is that when you understand the microstates of the system, you can predict how the system behaves for any arbitrary thermodynamic variable, okay? So the key is to understand this particular concept. When we image a system, even if it's in like a static kind of system, what we are really doing is that we are imaging the microstates, and then we can take these microstates and then develop them or use it to develop a model that can have predictive power for our system. In principle, if we have enough statistics, we should be able to take one of these images or several of these images and be able to predict the entire phase diagram, right? So the key part here is to understand that the response of any system is really encoded within the fluctuations. And so those fluctuations might be time dependent, but in this case, they might just be, you know, encoded within the images themselves. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So if we can image this, how can we then use this to predict the phase diagram? What do we actually need to make this concept work? It sounds really powerful. It sounds kind of crazy, but how do we actually make it work? Well, the first thing we need is we need some kind of model. So generally, you know, theorists have been very good for the last 100 years. They've come up with all types of generative models that we can use, such as, you know, a standardizing model, lattice models, force fields, and so forth. So there's plenty of models to choose from. The next thing is we need to compare the right statistics, right? So we have experimental data and we have, you know, our model. So what are we going to compare? How are we going to do theory experiment matching? For atomically resolved systems, it's pretty straightforward, right? So we can just compare the atomic configurations, and I'll explain what that is on the next slide. But we can also, for example, compare pair distribution functions and so forth that come from scattering data. The third thing, which is really important, is let's say that now I know what to compare. I'm going to compare my atomic configurations. What is the metric that I will choose to compare this, right? So the interesting thing is if you choose the wrong metric, then you can actually get some very divergent results. And so we can actually prove this. So there was a question in the last webinar by Jessica Kong about the loss functions in deep neural networks. And so that's a very important question when it comes to being able to make models of predictive power in physics-based systems. And the reason for this is because if you choose the wrong loss function, then you're going to have very divergent results that don't necessarily respect the physics of your system. So it has been proven, at least for the case of equilibrium thermodynamic systems, that the correct loss function to use in this case is the so-called statistical distance, right? So there's a few reasons for this, but basically you can think of it this way, right? If I have an equilibrium thermodynamic system A, which is my experiment, and I have another one B, which is my model, when I take samples from my experiment and I take samples from the model, if those samples are indistinguishable, then what that means is that we have a model which well represents the experiment. And so we can do this. This distinguishability metric is actually related to a concept called thermodynamic length. I won't go into it, but effectively it relates to distinguishability in Hilbert spaces. And the correct approach to use is the statistical distance, which we will use as opposed to other types of distinguishing metrics, such as, for example, the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is often used in machine learning. So with that said, let's try to tackle this one by one. So as I mentioned, there are lots of models, you know, that theorists have. The second thing that we need is we need to compare compare the right statistics. So in this case, we're going to choose atomic configurations. So what I mean by that is to say, can we look at how many atoms are present in the system in this image, and then look at their neighborhoods and then plot a histogram of those neighborhoods. So let's look at that in some detail, okay? So the first step is we can take an image and then we can run some deep learning on it, or we can do some thresholding, we can identify the atoms in the image, okay? So in this case, we're looking at iron selenide telluride. So we're looking at the top surface. So these are either selenium atoms or tellurium atoms based on their intensity. We can simply assign which atom is which. This is a scanning tunneling microscopy image. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at an individual atom. So in this case, I'm going to look at this blue atom. And I can see that it has two neighbors which are blue and two neighbors which are red. So I'm only going to consider the nearest neighbors. I'm not going to consider the diagonal neighbors. I'm just going to consider these four nearest neighbors, okay? So I can then say, okay, if I find this kind of configuration, then clearly I have this configuration here, this third configuration here, and I can repeat this for every atom that I see here, and I can build this histogram which tells me what is the probability of finding, for example, a blue atom surrounded by 4 blue atoms. It's about 9% in this case. Or, for example, a red atom surrounded by 3 red atoms and a blue atom. So apparently the chance of finding that is a little bit smaller, okay? So we can build a histogram, and this histogram basically contains the relevant information that we will need when we do our theory experiment matching. Okay, so this building the histogram is a little bit of a tedious step, but basically what we care about in this image are the probabilities of finding different configurations, because that really defines what these fluctuations are in the statistical sense. We need to be able to make these histograms from the images themselves, and so we can use a variety of tools in order to do that. So now we have this histogram, and so let's say we have a model. So the model in this case is just a simple interacting a non-ideal solid solution model. I'll show you in the next slide a little bit more detail. But basically, let's assume that we have our model and we have our experiment. And so what we're trying to do is try to minimize this distance between P and Q. Let's say that P is our model and Q is our experiment. And we need to try to minimize this arc length in probability space, which will minimize our statistical distance. And the way that we do that is basically by tweaking the model parameters such that this arc length is minimized. Okay, and so you can see actually what happens when you tweak the model such that this is minimized. You can see clearly here the error bars, by the way, come from the fact that we have multiple different images, and so we have a range of configurations. So we have kind of mean and standard deviations, but you can see that the model does a pretty good job of finding parameters that give a good match to the configurations that we actually see, and so we can say that the model is doing a good job of predicting the system in this particular case. Okay, so I kind of mentioned about why we should use statistical distance in the first place. One of the reasons for this is that basically it really correctly captures the fluctuations, which are quite essential for predictive capabilities. And it equalizes the weights of the experimental and simulated data, which is quite important when it comes to prediction power. So you can read more about that in this particular paper here. And I'm very happy to share this with, if you're interested and you don't have access, just send me an email. I'm very happy to share this with you. Okay. So, but this is all work done by Lucas and over a period of several years, where they show why this particular metric should be used. Okay, so with that said, let's try and see how it actually compares in terms of predictions, right? So here is our interacting solid solution model. So we have interactions that are in the same layer above, interactions that go to layers above and interactions that go to layers below. So that's why you have three particular terms in the energy functional here. And that's pretty straightforward. So in other words, let me explain as well. We have that we only image the top layer, right? So in STM, we're only imaging the top layer. However, our model is actually 3D, right? So we actually have a model which has, a 3D box full of atoms, and so we'll have interactions that go both sub layer, above layer, and interlayer in the layer, or intra-layer, I should say. And so anyway, we can take this model, we can fit the model to the data using this this optimization method, and then we can then take that model and we can sample from the model at different compositions and at different temperatures, right? So these are reduced temperatures, and you can see that as you go to different temperatures, you clearly have slightly different configurations that are present, and so this is what's predicted by the particular model, but it's basically coming from one particular image that was taken on a sample that was annealed at one particular temperature. So I want to go back to a previous slide where I basically showed, rather than having to sample throughout the temperature space, what you can do instead is you can say, okay, I only have one particular sample that I've studied and I've only done it at one temperature. Can I then use that to be able to predict how it should behave at different temperatures? And obviously, the further you go away from the temperature that you measured at, the more uncertain that prediction is going to be. But in principle, if you have enough statistics, if you have enough images, you should get relatively good predictive power from this kind of experiment. Okay, so I'm going to show you another couple of examples. So we don't have to do this necessarily predictions in temperature space. We can also do them across in compositional space. And so this is a paper that we've recently submitted. It's also on arXiv in case you're interested. But basically, people are interested in 2D materials like molybdenum disulfide, and the nice thing about molybdenum disulfide, or in this particular case, is that we can add some rhenium atoms to it. And when you add rhenium, initially at very small concentrations, they seem to have some kind of interactions to each other. But once you add a particular amount of radium, in this case about 55%, you can clearly see there's a structural transition, phase transition that occurs, and it gets stronger, and you can clearly see these kind of columns that are breaking out within these images. Now, this paper that we submitted, a lot of it was basically to show that the local structural distortions come from not the global concentration, but rather the local chemical concentrations, but that's neither here nor there. So the point is, we have these images, we can look at the local distortions, and we can look and isolate which of the atoms are molybdenum and which of the atoms are rhenium, and then we can go ahead and try and create different models and compare which model is more appropriate for our particular case. So, you know, theorists have come up with several different types of models that could work, and again, this modeling work was done by Lucas Wilczek. And basically, two very simple models are the pair additive model, where we have kind of these pairwise interactions that add compared. So when you sum over nearest neighbors of molybdenum and rhenium and then next nearest neighbors, or you can have a many-body interaction between kind of triplets. And so that's the second kind of model that we choose. It's not really that important, but suffice to say that these are the two models that we explored to try and explain the configurations that we are seeing within these particular images. And so again, just like the previous example, we will take our images and convert them to histograms of atomic configurations. Only now we have not 6 configurations, but plenty more. We have about 30, I believe, or 26, it seems, 26 configurations that we actually see. And we can plot how they behave for the different compositions. So this is the 5% rhenium case, and this one is a 95% rhenium case. And we can see how a random model compares to the pairwise model, as well as the experiment. So what you see here is the random model implies that there are no interactions at all. Everything is just random. And unfortunately, what this experiment is showing us is that a lot of the data that we're seeing can more or less be explained by random interactions. So certainly at low concentrations and at high concentrations, you see that the red columns are very closely matched to the teal columns. So that means that, you know, at least at these particular, if we just looked at these particular compositions, it would suggest that there's not really a lot of information to be had from these images in terms of trying to extract a particular interaction energy between either the pairwise or the triplet model. However, if we look at intermediate concentrations, particularly the 55% and the 78%, you can see that, for example, the teal is distinct from both models, both the random model and the pairwise model. So what this is telling us is that the models are not doing a good job, at least the pairwise model is not doing a great job of actually replicating what we're seeing in experiments. So there could be multiple reasons for this. It could be that the model is incorrect. It could be that we really don't have enough statistics. So we only have these 4 images. We would like to get more, but we kind of work with what we have. So we kind of need more images, and some of these configurations are quite rare. So it could be that if we can get more images, we'll be able to fit the model, and it'll be substantially better than what it is right now. But nonetheless, it's quite instructive to see that even by just looking at one image, we can immediately, and comparing it to a random model, we can at least say that we actually have some interactions here, and it's not completely random. However, whatever model that we've chosen is insufficient to explain what we're seeing. So this is kind of just showing that again. You can also choose the pairwise additive model or the triplet model. They all kind of show the same kind of features. In other words, the experiment shows different results to what the model actually shows. But it's not. I would not say that it's not useful. It's certainly a little bit useful. But it's just not perfect. So we kind of have to deal with that. But one of the interesting things about doing analysis this way is that we can actually get confidence within our models, right? So we can do model selection. So what we're plotting here is just the loss function, right? So we can plot a loss function for both of these models, and we can compare what it would be for example, for the random model. So for the random model, we clearly have 0 interactions, so that's why it's at the 0, 0 point. So, and you have some kind of loss here. The single parameter model shows a deeper loss as indicated by the darker blue, but the 2-parameter model shows an even deeper loss, okay? So the question then is, should I go with a model with a single parameter, or should I go with a model with 2 parameters, or should I stick to the random model, right, in this case? Both for the pair additive case, or in the many-model case, we only have the, a random versus a 2-parameter model. But in the pair additive case, we have a 2-parameter pair additive model, a single parameter pair additive model, and a random model. So we really need to find out which model should we choose, right? Just because the loss is lower, it doesn't mean that that's a better model, because obviously there's more degrees of freedom, and it might be that the extra degrees of freedom are overfitting to our case. So can we find that out, right? And we actually can. You can use an information criterion approach. And so that's kind of summarized in this table. It's not particularly useful to go through it, but we can basically say that we can determine which of these models, based on the Bayesian information criterion approach, is most suitable. And so it turns out that the pair additive model with the single parameter is a better fit than the random model or than the 2-parameter model for this particular case. So we can do model selection through this approach. Now, maybe this was not the best example because we don't have perfectly conclusive results, but unfortunately, most of experiments are actually like this. So this is quite useful because now that these models are developed, let's say that I'm on the microscope, right? What I can do is I can take these models, and I can take the deep learning frameworks that Maxim has developed, and I can try to generate these in almost real time, right? And so once I'm generating this is, you know, still work that needs to be done, but in principle, it's perfectly doable for us to take what we have here, implement it online on a stem, and say, okay, how many more samples do I need before I'll be more or less certain that this model is preferred over this model? To what confidence, right? So we can actually adjust where we are sampling on the microscope based on what this kind of data is giving us. And this is a real key distinction, right? So a lot of people will talk about trying to capture the most amount of information possible using an information theoretic approach for things like active learning, or you know, trying to improve our parameter space exploration. What I want to hint at here is that rather than doing it in terms of pure information theory, we can actually do it in terms of physics, right? If I have a physics hypothesis that I think that many body model is preferable in this particular system, and I want to be certain of that to within 1%, 99% confidence, then how many data sets do I need to acquire, right? And so we can actually calculate this in real time, in principle, through these kinds of approaches, and that work kind of remains ongoing. So I'd like to show you one last example where we actually, we don't have to be restricted to 2D materials or just the surface. We can actually incorporate information that comes from both the surface as well as the bulk. So in this case, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at an A-site terminated manganite. So this is lanthanum calcium manganese oxide, and we're looking at the lanthanum calcium oxide surface. And so what we're imaging here are oxygen atoms. And you can't really see it here, but there are slight distortions of the oxygen that we're seeing. And those apparently, we found out that those, according to DFT at least, seem to correspond to areas where lanthanum is. And so we could try to identify the positions where lanthanum is on this particular surface, as well as where the oxygen atoms actually are. And so we have this kind of data. The other thing that we have for this particular sample is that we actually have angle resolved XPS data, which is kind of shown here and published in this particular paper here. What it shows is that we have calcium segregation as you get towards the surface. And this is a known feature of most manganites. They often, you know, there's a tendency because of electrostatics that calcium will migrate to the surface, and there are also strain-related reasons for this. But nonetheless, we see this kind of segregation of calcium towards the surface, okay? So how do we combine the information that we have from atomically resolved imaging, as well as this kind of macroscopic information that comes from XPS in our particular model? And so that's what we actually ended up doing for a paper that was published in ACS Nano last year. So the first step is to try to identify atomic positions. So again, we can use Maxim's networks. We can find where the oxygen atoms are, and then through some clever filtering, we can also try to identify where the lanthanum atoms are. And so we actually find, you know, situations where we can have oxygen vacancies as well, and so we can compute the histograms And so we can compare situations where lanthanum is next to oxygen and where it's actually on the surface without a neighboring oxygen, apical oxygen atom on the surface. So, this is all kind of also shown in previous slides. We just take these images, we convert them to histograms because that's what we actually need. So the next thing is, what about the generative model in this case? So the generative model in this case is, again, it's going to be like an icing kind of model, but now we're going to have 3 different terms to it. So the energy of a configuration is going to be, in this case, this is just bulk energy with interactions. This is actually a surface between lanthanum and lanthanum atoms, kind of a lanthanum repulsions. And in this case, this is going to be the interaction between lanthanum and oxygen that's on the surface. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the bulk term is the interaction between calcium and lanthanum. And so our loss function looks like this, right? Our loss function is S squared, which is our statistical distance squared. And it's going to be a function of the surface configurations with oxygen, the surface configurations without oxygen, as well as the calcium concentration profile. So we know the concentration profile from XPS, and we know these two from the experiment in terms of the STM data, right? So we can actually combine this data in one particular loss, and then we can optimize using this particular statistical distance optimization tool to be able to identify what are the interaction energies that we have in this particular system. And so this is just showing what this is. So here we have the calculated, as a result of this optimization, the calculated interaction energies. And you can see, this is lanthanum calcium is 1.65 kilojoules per mole, so rather small. Lanthanum repulsion is quite large, as you would expect. And then the lanthanum oxygen interaction energy is negative, as you would expect as well. And so here is the comparison to experiment. So remember I said that there are 3 different components to the loss. So these are the 3 different histograms that we get based on the image and based on the simulation. And you can see clearly that by incorporating this XPS data, right, so we can clearly model the XPS data, and it really helps us because although we can't see the atoms underneath the surface, we can at least get some microscopic statistics of what's going on layer by layer, and we can use this to constrain the model further. And then I can take this model, and then I can start to do things like I can look at what the bulk looks like in this model according to what the optimized model says. So what we got out from this is that basically unfavorable electrostatic interactions between the lanthanum and lanthanum atoms, as well as favorable elastic interactions, basically tended towards increased segregation. And this is a result that was also quite similar to DFT simulations that were performed at MIT a few years ago. So but this actually didn't use any DFT, right? So we just go straight from experiment to these kinds of interaction energies, and we can get the same kind of results that you would get from first principles on this particular system. I mind you that first principles are a little bit difficult for manganites, but nonetheless, it's a good proof of concept that you can use this method to be able to predict for relatively complex systems like manganites. Okay, and so I'm almost done here, but basically these are just plots to show you the reduced free energy of segregation. Basically, you see that it's relatively flat. You don't really see a lot of segregation. You don't see like a phase diagram where you have phase separation as such, which is kind of somewhat expected in the manganites. Although you can probably argue that a lot of these are kinetically limited. Anyway, I won't touch on that point. Okay, so now we have our generated model, right? Can I plot the phase diagram without actually understanding what's going on? Okay, so one way to plot the phase diagram is to make our own features and try to compare how those features evolve for the different samples of the model at different temperatures and concentrations. However, it was shown, I think 3 years ago now, in a Nature Physics paper that if you take something like an Ising model and run it through an autoencoder, which is basically a neural network, then we can actually start to identify regions of the phase diagram automatically. So in an automated or unsupervised manner, start to explore the phase diagram. And so what we did was to say, okay, maybe we can take this approach for this particular system. And so what I'm plotting here is a latent variable. So this actually comes from an autoencoder. It's a standard variational autoencoder. So effectively, you think of it like there's an encoding process which encodes your data into a small number of latent variables, and then a decoding process where the opposite occurs, and then you go back to the input configuration. What's happening here is that we've chosen a couple of different latent variables. In this case, I'm just going to look at the first latent variable, and you can see that when I plot it as a function of calcium concentration, it seems to show this nice curve, which interestingly matches the same kind of structure that we see here, right? So as a function of calcium concentration. So what it's telling me is that for some reason, which we're not quite sure how this works yet, but it does look a lot like the free energy landscape for this particular system when we run it through a variational autoencoder. It also tells us that because we don't see large jumps anywhere, that we really don't seem to have phase separation occurring, which we expect to see in something like, for example, an Ising model where we see clear phase transition. In this case, we don't see that. We can also, try to compare what the segregation tendency is for different concentrations. But because this is, like a solid solution kind of behavior, we really don't see obvious transitions. So just to recap, our framework is that you start with a target image. It can be atomically resolved, or it can be mesoscopic as well. It doesn't have to be atomic, by the way. So if you work on AFM, for example, it can be for example, magnetic force microscopy images that will work. But we do some image analytics, and this is where a lot of the deep learning will come in. And then we can identify the positions of the atoms, or at least different configurations if you're mesoscopic. Go ahead and do the data collection. So we create these histograms, generate a model, a generative model, and do a search for parameters. And then optimize that model, and then you can make predictions using this optimized model. So if applied in real time, this can really help us to answer, the question of how much data do you really need when you're sitting at the microscope to answer a particular hypothetical scientific question. Okay. So with that, I just want to again remind you that I'm from the CNMS, which is a user facility. So if you'd like to use any of the tools that are mentioned, go ahead and just contact me. It just requires writing a 2-page user proposal, like most other facilities. So yeah, I'm very happy to talk to you if you're interested in any of this. With that said, I'm going to thank you, and I guess I'll take any questions before moving to the Colab notebook.
Thank you very much for the very nice presentation. So we have one question from the audience. So from Matthias Vienna, I think he just left. So I will just read out the question for everyone. Sure. So the question is, how does if the model encodes only first neighbor information?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question fully.
So how does your model can capture the long scale pattern for the material if your model deals only short range first neighbor
that's a good question.
interaction? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what is that's the important thing there, is that just because you only consider nearest neighbor interactions, it does not mean that you don't actually you are not able to capture more long range interactions. So because it's an effective interaction, right? So in principle, you should still be able to capture somewhat long range effects. If they're really long, then obviously the number of statistics you need to capture is going to be extraordinarily large. So we can actually start to incorporate next nearest and larger and larger, go out to larger and larger cells in order to see if that's required. But we never really needed to do that because at the end of the day, you want to have the simplest model that explains your data. And so we're not implying that there are no long-range interactions, but we're just saying that it is possible to model it with only considering the nearest neighbor interaction in this case. So again, it's an effective interaction. It's not actually that you only have nearest neighbor interactions.
Okay, thank you. So Rama, yeah. I also have one question. So the idea of looking at the crystal and to determine the property is very interesting. So so do you think in principle we can also apply the technique to, for example, high entropy alloy with like multiple components or even amorphous materials? So do you know if there's any progress along this line?
Yeah, so we're actually working on on an example of a high entropy alloy and trying to predict the phase diagram based on atom probe tomography data. So in this case, you'll have like 1 million atoms, and so you don't have necessarily atomic configurations in the same way, because APT data is not resolved to the unit cell level or subunit cell level, but it's at least resolved to 1 nanometer, right? So we will basically get that, you know, and let's say iron is surrounded by nickel and chromium, you know, in terms of a shell, right, a certain percentage of the time. And so, yeah, we are working on a paper on that. So in principle, it should work, particularly in those systems where it's very hard to model. And I think that's where the real benefit will come, right? So some of these systems, you know, they have relatively good models for the 2D materials, for example. But a lot of systems where we're not quite sure how to model it, this approach could work really well. So relaxers are a good example of that. But high entropy alloys are another great example of that. So.
Okay, great. I think there's no more question, and we can proceed with your tutorial.
Okay, so let me share Safari. Yes, I think you can see my. So I'm gonna. I hope that everybody has this. I hope everybody has access to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run this cell. So Maxim gave a really nice introduction to how to run Colab notebooks. And so he's really the king of Colab notebooks in our group. I'm not as advanced as he is I don't make notebooks that are as nice as him, so I apologize. But hopefully this will be useful. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at an Ising type model, and we're going to take simulated data, and we're going to try and apply this particular framework that I just described to be able to extract an interaction energy based on imaging data that we basically simulate. Okay, so everything here will be simulated, so we know the ground truth. But you can obviously apply this to experimental data as well if you have the right kind of system. So let's go ahead and run the cell. And as this is unzipping and loading, I'll just give you an introduction to the Ising model. So we basically have an Ising model on n-squared lattice sites, and where on each lattice site you have an associated value, which is the spin, which can be plus or minus 1. And the energy, and we're just going to ignore the magnetic field for the moment, is given by this Hamiltonian equation here, the entropic interaction parameter, multiplied by the sum over ij. So where ij are the nearest neighbors. So we sum over all the nearest neighbors, and so this gives us the energies of the different configurations, and we just sum that totally to get the energy of the system divided by n squared, where n squared is the number of lattice sites. So we perform simulations using metropolis sampling. These are kind of technicalities, and I don't really have time to go through these. But most people who've done condensed matter physics will have done at least know something about the Ising model. And I can encourage you to have a look at textbooks which explain this. But this has been known for since 1940s basically. So we can simulate this, and our student Mani Belletti, who was kind of instrumental in this work, did these simulations. So I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of the work that you're seeing in this particular notebook actually came from our student. So anyway, with that said, let's just look at the data. So what we're going to do is this cell basically just loads the data, and this cell actually plots it. So what we have here is that we have an Ising model for different interaction parameters. We can plot the absolute magnetization, and so you can see that at low temperature we have magnetization. So you have basically it's completely magnetic or ferromagnetic, and then at the higher temperatures you have this ferromagnetic to paramagnetic transition, and so the net absolute magnetization drops. The susceptibility increases near the phase transitions as we would expect, similar to the specific heats. And so this here is just the energy per site as a function of temperature. So let's have a look at what the configurations are actually look like. So when we do this simulation, we're actually simulating all these different kinds of configurations, right? So this is actually image data. So let's just run this cell and see what these images look like. So it'll take a little bit of time. Okay. So the simulations have been done with different. Hello, are you able to hear me? Okay. Okay. Yes. So the simulations have been done with different values of the interaction parameter. The J can vary between a negative value and a positive value. And this actually is like it's very cool diagram because it shows you the phase diagram of the system for different J's and different temperatures. So at low temperature for positive J, you have a ferromagnetic system, and so you can either be, 1 or 1. At high temperature, you start to become more paramagnetic, as you would expect. But if you have a negative interaction parameter, in other words, you kind of have repulsion, then you'll actually have an antiferromagnetic case. So in other words, neighboring spins want to be oppositely aligned to each other, and that's exactly what you see in this part of the phase diagram. So we have all the simulated data, and so now I want you to think about how this would actually work in a real experiment. In a real experiment, maybe you're going to do some kind of STM measurement, maybe you're going to do some kind of microscopy measurement, and you'll see these kind of configurations. Maybe you'll get this particular image here, this particular image here, and then the question is, okay, so what is the interaction parameter that I should choose in my model that will be able to replicate what I'm seeing in these particular images? And that's the exact example that we're going to take in this particular collab notebook. Okay, so that's called the inverse problem. So the forward problem is pretty straightforward, right? So for different J's and different temperatures, let's simulate how this would look like. But the inverse problem is more difficult, and that's where we can use our framework to be able to answer this question. So let's go through that a little bit. Let's first look at our experimental data set. Okay, so I'm going to run this notebook, this cell. And so here is our experimental data, and it's basically a pandas data frame. Right? Yeah, it's kind of plotting as a pandas data frame. Anyway, so we have 75 different rows and we have 13 different columns. So each of these is kind of a different snapshot, if you will. Okay, so the difference is that each of these were captured, for example, at different kinds of temperatures. So maybe I can move across and find this. Yeah, so here you see that the temperature varies between 0.1 and 40. This is a reduced temperature unit, so it's just based on the phase, based on 1/kT kind of thing. But nonetheless, we have experiments that were conducted at different types of temperatures, and then those give us the different configurations that we can actually plot. So let's just take a look at some of these. Okay. So here are my experimental configurations at different temperatures. Okay, so again, assume that this is the data that you got. Okay, you got images that look like this. So you took your sample, you did some temperature-related study, in this case, magnetic force microscopy, and so you saw this. Okay, as a function of temperature. So again, the first step to do here is we run through our framework. What does our framework say? Well, the first thing to do is we take these images and we can go from images to configurations histograms, okay, because the histogram contains the information that we need in order to do our modeling. So again, configurations, as we mentioned in the presentation, are configurations that look like this. We look at the nearest neighbors and we say, okay, if I look at the nearest neighbors here and they're, my nearest neighbors are all the same type, then I have configuration 1. If they're all different types, if they're all of the opposite type, then I have configuration 6, and then of course I have the other configurations in between. So luckily, this is somewhat tedious, but you can actually write NumPy scripts to do this relatively quickly. It's a little bit tedious, and I'm going to leave this as an exercise for you all, so you can go ahead and do that. But this has actually already been done for us within our within the notebook. So I'm going to run this, and So let's have a look at what the results show. Okay, so again, all that's been done here is to convert these images to these kinds of histograms based on the configurations that we are plotting up here. Okay, so again, if I look at this particular image, clearly I have configuration 1. And that wherever I go in this image, there's a 100% probability of finding configuration 1. Okay, that's also one are considered the same, but we're looking at the absolute value here. We just either there's a magnetization or there isn't. So it's just a stochastic problem. So you need to bear that in mind. And it's symmetric. So in any case, you see that it's somewhat less probable now to find this configuration. And so now I'm starting to see evidence of other configurations as well. So you see here, for example, there's a little bit of bunching in this case, which is showing up in these configurations. As I increase the temperature further, you can clearly see this kind of mosaic kind of pattern, and so it becomes a more uniform kind of distribution. And then I increase the temperature, it becomes a little bit, it changes again. So the key here is to realize that as we change the temperature, we change these images, but we also change the probabilities of finding different configurations. And what our modeling is really trying to do is it's trying to predict how these configurations will change at different temperatures, right? Or that's what it should try to do. And we can then use this in order to be able to optimize our model such that it predicts this correctly, okay? So again, this is just, I tried to write this down in terms of like relatively straightforward language as to why we use statistical distance instead of mean squared error. But basically, let's just run these cells, which will do this kind of optimization and pick the correct values for the interaction parameter that match these histograms here, right? That minimize this particular distance or loss. So we can also, so there we've done that. We can plot the loss landscape. I'm going to skip this for now because it's a little bit difficult for without understanding the next plot. So let's just plot the results. So the results shown here. This is the interaction parameter. So in our experimental case, we know the ground truth because we simulated it, and the ground truth features as far as this interaction parameter is concerned. So we took an image, we looked at the different configurations that it had, and then we tried to find the interaction parameter that best matched those configurations using an optimization technique, and we got this particular value, and we got a standard deviation as well. So a few things. First thing is, even at a ridiculously high temperature, right, of 40, right, where you would assume that all you see is kind of random configurations. Apparently, there is still enough information in those images that your reconstructed interaction parameter is really close to the actual value, right? The standard deviation increases with temperature, as you would expect, but even when you sample very, very far from the phase transition, apparently there is enough information present, right? There is enough non-randomness, as it were, present to be able to derive an interaction parameter that actually makes some sense. And this is just the same plot, but plotted kind of as a distribution. So basically, you can see how the distribution or the mean of the distribution is the same, but as you go with increasing temperature, the distribution widens with increasing temperature. So this is exactly as you would expect, because you become a little bit more uncertain as you go to higher temperatures because your randomness is increased and you have less meaningful configurations that you're actually sampling that would tell you that there's an interaction parameter. Anyway, but this is a really striking plot in many ways because it shows you a bunch of things that are not quite intuitive, right? You might assume that we should be right at the phase transition or really close to the phase transition to get really accurate results. But apparently this method shows you don't have to be. You can be quite far away from the phase transition and still get meaningful reconstructions. I'll leave it to you. Oh, sorry, the last thing I want to explain here before I kind of end is the loss landscape. And you can see that the loss landscape, as you increase temperature, it becomes more difficult to find the minima. And so that's where it becomes more challenging. Whereas at low temperature, the minima is like, it's a little bit easier to see on these plots. With that said, you can run through this notebook, and then I would hope that you go ahead and try and do this for your own data, right? Create your own model, but use the same framework that we've illustrated to be able to come up with interaction parameters that can explain, your atomic resolve data. I'm very happy to consult with you on this. Give me an email if you have any questions. But yeah, I hope this has been quite useful.
Okay, thank you very much, Rama, for your very good presentation. So I think we have no more questions from the audience. So this would conclude our today's session. So again, I want to thank all the speakers again. I also want to thank everyone for participating in today's virtual session. So we will be processing these videos and post on our APS GDS YouTube channel. And there will be more virtual session in the coming weeks. So please stay tuned. You'll be receiving GDS emails, and you can also follow us up on our APS GDS social media like Facebook and Twitter. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you. And well, great. Let me stop recording. Hi, Jay, William, are you still here?
I see
Yes.
that.
Can you stop recording?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The recording stopped. So